Good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Once again, have this opportunity to join you to hear a story of someone whose love for Jesus Christ opened their heart to a walk that brought them to the Catholic Church. It was, again, often not what their goal was. Their goal was to follow Christ and to be faithful to Christ. Our guest tonight is Father Warren Tanghe. He's a former Episcopal priest. And Father Tanghe, great to have you on the program.
It's a great privilege to be with you.
You and I, the audience wouldn't know this, but you and I met, oh boy, that's almost 13 years ago,
Yes.
when you came to EWTN to support, as a friend, one of my former Journey Home guests.
Yes, indeed.
And you and I met then, but back then you were still an Episcopal priest.
I was.
And, maybe leaning, but I can't remember if we talked. I can't remember much 13 years ago, but it's great to have you on the program.
Thank you.
And let me get out of the way and invite you to take us way back. Let's hear your journey.
Well, I was baptized as a Roman Catholic. My father was a career officer in the U.S. Army. My mother was one of the first American dependents allowed into occupied Japan. My father was Catholic, my mother Episcopal. My mother had made the promises that were required of in mixed marriages in those days. So I was baptized in the Catholic Church. When my father went off to combat in Korea a few years later, my mother took me every Sunday to the Catholic parish in her hometown, Great Neck, New York. Unfortunately, one day I was a little obstreperous. The church was and is very beautiful. It has a lot of mosaics. And I was sort of, "Mommy, who's that? Mommy, who's that?" And Father turned around and said, "Get that child out of here," which was the end of my brief stay in the Catholic Church. My mother then started taking me simply to the Episcopal Church. And I was raised in the Episcopal Church. A lot of the time when we were on postings, I went to generic Protestant services. When we were in the States or when there was something available in our postings, we went to the Episcopal Church. During my teenage,
I was going to ask you, if you're going to teenage years, back in those days, and I don't want to ask how far ago that was, but the Episcopal Church was a different church.
Very definitely, very definitely. The Episcopal Church in Great Neck was not particularly high church in terms of its ritual, though it did have a very rich musical tradition. But it was very Catholic in the kind of teaching. Yeah. The Episcopal Church has Catholic, Protestant, middle stump traditionally. Yeah. And while the liturgical practice was kind of middle stump, the teaching was full and rich. Actually, the Episcopal priest who was pastor there in my time, Mr. McKechnie, was a convert from the Presbyterian Church.
Right.
So,
my thinking was then, as a young man, there would not have been that much of a difference to go from the Catholic to the Episcopal in those years, and the beauty of the tradition and yes. What we call the patrimony. Indeed. Was very strong.
Indeed. Now, when I was in high school, I got hooked on what I'll call scientism. You know, science has the answers. Science is going to make everything wonderful. If there's a problem that hasn't been solved, it's because science hasn't solved it yet. And really fell away from any living faith, though we did go to church from time to time. It was through a humanities course in my high school. And I commuted into New York City. I won a scholarship to a really fine school that no longer exists, the Rhodes School. Through a humanities course there, I had a whole different kind of encounter with religion. Each of us was assigned to teach a class, and I drew the straw that said, Book of Job. So I went deep into the Book of Job. I remember that going out and buying a copy of what was then the new Anchor Bible commentary on Job to kind of help me do this. And discovered that there was a whole range of questions that lay beyond the competence of science. And I have to say that my science teachers were people of integrity who helped me see this. We also, in that class, read a book by John Henry Newman called the Apologia Pro Vita Sua, or we read selections from it. And again, that fed things. So I decided, I was very attracted by the kind of Anglicanism that Newman came out of. But it was also obvious that Newman came to the Catholic Church. So I walked down Fifth Avenue from my school to St. Patrick's Church and asked to see a priest. And pretty much got told that, if I had been baptized Catholic, I should go to confession and then make arrangements to get confirmed. And sorry, he didn't have time to talk with me, which was a disappointment. I went to an Anglican church called St. Mary the Virgin, which at least at that time was the acme of high church Anglo-Catholic Anglicanism. And the priest there had lots of time for me, answering my questions, very patient with me. Heard my first confession, and so that became my identity in the Episcopal Church. Over the next couple years, I felt drawn to the Episcopal ministry. In college, I entered the ordination process. I went to General Seminary in New York City, was ordained in the Diocese of Long Island, served as a curate, an associate for 2 years in Rhode Island, then went over to England to study, and eventually, especially when I ran out of money, I ministered there. I had the great privilege of doing that. Came back to the United States and served a variety of congregations. The time I spent in England, I think, was critically important because what I was taught in seminary under the rubric of Anglo-Catholicism was in fact a kind of watered down or version of the Catholic faith. When I was in Oxford, I had the privilege of working with, my supervisor, for instance, was a Catholic priest, Father Yarnold of the Society of Jesus. One of my best friends was an Anglican about to become a Catholic, a guest on your show, Father John Sayward.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And I had a spiritual director who was a retired bishop. Together, they confronted me with the contradictions or anomalies in the kind of Anglo-Catholicism I had been trained to espouse. And they brought me to the conviction that the teaching of the Catholic Church is the truth, and to a real desire for union with the Catholic Church. Though that desire really didn't bubble over until I had the privilege of spending some time with Jean Vanier's L'Arche in France. And just, it was an overwhelming spiritual experience for me. I returned thinking, okay, that's it. I'm going to become Catholic. Those who were guiding me, though, asked me this question. In those days, the ecumenical movement was going full blast. Yeah. And there was a genuine belief that Anglicans and Roman Catholics would achieve a common expression of the faith and full communion as a result. Should I go and enter the Catholic Church as an individual, or should I remain an Anglican and work as an Anglican for that reunion? And I came to the conclusion that God's purpose for me at that time was that I remain an Anglican and I work for that reunion. I was active in the Ecumenical Society of the Blessed Virgin Mary, active in discussions with the Orthodox. Excuse me. And when I came back to the United States, I had the privilege of serving as ecumenical officer in 2 different Episcopal dioceses, in Louisville, Kentucky, and then down in Atlanta, Georgia. And always my heartfelt desire was reunion certainly a reunion of East and West, but reunion of Anglicans with the rock from which they were hewn.
Yeah. And there's a lot of questions that arise. Maybe we can get to them later in this, because there is that tension that a clergyman feels, whether he's Anglican or Presbyterian, when he discovers the beauty of the Catholic Church. The question is, do I go, or do I recognize that unless I stay, these people will never otherwise hear? Who are they going to hear it from? Are they going to listen to a pope or to a cardinal or a bishop or a priest or a Catholic unless they hear it from me? So there's that tension. And let me ask you another question, given that whole issue. Discerning God's will in your life, there is a bit difference in discerning the will of God from a Catholic perspective than there might be from an Anglican perspective, or a Presbyterian or a Baptist or a Methodist. So part of the struggle there is, at the same time you're trying to decide whether I should become Catholic, you're still thinking a little bit like an Anglican.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, talk about that time when you're trying to, where is God leading me?
Well, you actually raised two different times, but the time in Oxford, I'd had a rough time dealing with the very clear division between the Catholic side of Anglicanism and the evangelical and Calvinist side of Anglicanism in England. I was very attracted to the ways in which evangelicals sought to spread the faith, but I had a lot of trouble with the faith that they were seeking to spread. Anglo-Catholics seemed to be content to stay in their own little conventicles and not have such a burning desire to bring the gospel to others. So in that sense, I tried to take stuff from both, successfully or unsuccessfully. But in England, it is very easy to be Anglican. It's the official church. And I can't say in conscience that there wasn't some element of that in my decision, though certainly in terms of my conscious mind, it was, let's see if we can play a very small part in bringing about this desired reunion.
Yeah, all right.
When I was a parish priest back in the United States, I was facing to me, massive changes in the Episcopal Church, departures from its historic faith and historic Anglicanism. Initially, I tried to serve my parish as a beacon of that tradition, of the place where it would be upheld. And we attracted a lot of people. A lot of people from evangelical traditions who were yearning for the fullness of the faith, and a faith with deep roots. But as the situation in the Episcopal Church worsened, many of those people said, I cannot stay here. Being Episcopal has become an embarrassment. So most of them became Roman Catholics. Where was I? I had joined an organization. It had several names, but the last one was Forward in Faith. Forward in Faith initially tried to carve out a place in the Episcopal Church for those who held to its historic faith and order, and to do that as a means of bringing the Episcopal Church back to its historic faith and order. Over time, that clearly didn't work. The Episcopal Church was moving further and further away from that historic faith and order. So we then started looking for outside help from overseas Anglicans, to create an entity for us. I was very active in that attempt. And one of the things that struck me was that outside Anglicanism was, for the most part, very Calvinist and evangelical. I remember once sitting with the then primate of Rwanda, who grew up as a Catholic. And he was asked, not by me because I'm shy, of why he had become an Anglican. And he said, there is a difference in the understanding of salvation. And I found myself, basically he was saying, if a person has faith, they're saved. It's all taken care of. And I had deeply bought the Catholic package. I wasn't there. I attended an international conference. The liturgy was celebrated using the rites of the Church of Kenya. I did not feel able to receive because of what I saw as deficiencies in that rite. I found myself less and less able to see my Catholic identity as anything but not just a margin in the Episcopal Church, marginalized even in this attempt to recapture something more substantive of Anglican history. So I came to the sisters in Catonsville as their chaplain, sort of saying, well, this is a place where I can hide. It's a safe place where I can hide.
Tell the audience, many of the audience don't realize that there are Anglican sisters.
There are indeed. At one point in the 1950s, there were more Anglican monks and nuns in England than there had been Catholic monks and nuns at the time of the Reformation.
I had no idea.
This is one of the reasons why people in the Catholic movement thought the Catholic movement was alive, flourishing, and coming to and helping Anglicanism redefine itself. One of the reasons why people really thought that the push for unity was going to succeed. The All Saints Sisters of the Poor were founded in London in the 1830s. They existed to care for women who were out on the streets, often with their children. If their husbands had died or been seriously injured, there was no security net underneath them. The sisters were brought to Baltimore to look after widows and orphans, initially in connection with Mount Calvary Church, which is one of the 3 Baltimore parishes that have entered the Catholic Church corporately in the new ordinariate. The sisters continued with a variety of different ministries. By the time I got there, their primary ministry was supporting a hospice called the Joseph Ritchie Hospice, and giving birth to a hospice for children called Dr. Bob's Place. The opening of Dr. Bob's Place has been much delayed, but we're looking forward to it in this new year. Joseph Ritchie Hospice is well established. So I came as chaplain to this small community. I believe at the time there were 13 in profession. And to me, it was a kind of hiding place. It was clear to me that no matter how tolerant the Bishop of Atlanta was towards me and my congregation, we were on the margins all the way. So I came to pray, to discern, to serve by giving, of course, celebrating the liturgy, preaching, but also giving retreats, doing spiritual direction, leading quiet days or days of recollection and the like, and had a wonderful ministry there. It was clear to me that ultimately the sisters also really didn't have a home place in the Episcopal Church. We were very distant from the church around us. It's interesting, most of the people who are Anglicans who came to us for retreat were from the evangelical side down in Northern Virginia. But there came a day when the superior came to me and said, we'll never get any vocations from what the Episcopal Church has become. Where we are and where they are, it just doesn't work. And so she asked me if I would use my contacts through Forward in Faith to expose the sisters to some of the Anglican alternatives. At the time, and I mean no disrespect by this, one of the journals reported that there were 53 different groups that had been constituted to try to preserve traditional Anglicanism. I chose a sampling of the largest and strongest of those, and we had really fine presentations from the people who represented them. But in the end, the sisters just said, you know, it doesn't work. Nothing here makes our hearts sing.
Were these independent 50-some men,
Yes.
whether they really are,
Yeah.
were they all in union with the Archbishop of Canterbury?
No.
So some of them were just independent Anglican groups in name only?
All of them were independent Anglican groups.
Okay.
Some of them had relationships with other primates in the Anglican Communion. For instance, there's a group, was and is a group called the Anglican Mission in America, which was sponsored from Rwanda and Singapore.
Okay.
There's a group called Cana, which is sponsored from Nigeria. But none of them has been officially recognized by the Archbishop of Canterbury, even though today, there's a meeting being held by the Archbishop and representatives of a group that became an umbrella for some of these groups, the Anglican Church in North America, are taking part in that gathering, starting in London today.
I remember reading the story about a group of evangelical pastors that in their own experience had been drawn to traditional church liturgy, sacraments, and they wanted to start from scratch and discover what was the church they needed to be a part of. And as they began their study, the first thing they said was, we'll be open to everything but no Pope. And so the Catholic Church was never an option. When I think about those 53 groups of Anglicans, they're not happy with Episcopalianism, where it's going, the Anglican where it's going. Did any of them even think Rome first, or did they just say, no Pope, we're just doing our own thing?
There is a very clear issue between monarchical government and collegial government. Now, sitting inside the Catholic Church, I recognize that what people in my Anglican community thought about that isn't really true. The Catholic Church is a vigorous blend of the collegial and the monarchical, with sometimes the monarchical helping the collegial move itself along, and sometimes with the monarchical helping say, guys, I think we're getting off the track. But most of these Anglicans look for a more collegial form of governance in which the bishops are equal to one another, and the bishops pretty much take the lead. Papal monarchy is something that they just have troubles with. Though sometimes if you were to step back from the issues, you'd say, hey, they had somebody who could, the Catholic Church has somebody who can step in when the kinds of things that were going on in the Episcopal Church first started and say, no way. Where the Archbishop of Canterbury could express his concerns, but what does that matter?
Yeah. And I remember, in fact, the second guest that we had on the Journey Home program, I don't know if you recall, was Father Graham Leonard. The former Bishop of London.
Indeed.
And his issue was, even given the understanding of the collegial relationships, he began realizing, what authority do I have at all? Because it had become so democratic.
Yep.
At these collegial gatherings, any individual bishop, really, there were lobbyist groups and then the pressures that were coming, and it's become like so many of the other major mainline denominations where it's not all that different from American politics, sadly. That's how truth is discerned. And so the rise of those 53 groups are really a struggle to how to deal with this very issue.
I think people were trying to create lifeboats that were very much like the boat that sank. And each of them had a perspective on what was the key defect that led to that boat sinking. But many of them have not really seen that lifeboats are fine for a time. But ultimately, you got to find dry land.
Because the waves of culture can get pretty big.
The waves of culture are overwhelming.
Yeah.
Overwhelming.
That's right. Why don't we pause there? It's probably a good time for a break. It's a little early, but let's pause there because I also want to, before we move on, you're almost thinking about the Catholic Church, and I'm wondering how those sisters, kind of the contemplative ladies, how are they figuring out what's going on in the church around them and how they themselves drawn to the Catholic Church, and then you. But I also want to find out how, when your time in England, what did you deal with how that whole Anglican thing started? You know, Henry VIII and all that issues, because it seems like the way a thing starts often sets the trajectory for the whole long history. And I'd like to talk about that when we get back.
Great.
All right? So see you in a bit. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host, and our guest is Father Warren Tanghe, former Episcopal priest. We've cut you in the middle of the story when you're at that point where you're starting to look. I asked that question about Henry VIII. I don't know when you want to get to that, but that's...
Let's stay with the sisters.
Fine. Okay. Very good. Fine.
You asked how was it that these sisters were so aware of what was going on? And the answer is kind of simple. The community had a lot of associates around the country. The community ran regular retreats. And as a consequence, the sisters learned from others what was happening. But more than that, their own relationships. For instance, when a gay man was consecrated bishop, the sisters were deeply troubled. One of their vocations was amazed that they were troubled and left to go to another community. So their own experience really affected that. So we did these visits with Anglican alternatives, and nothing seemed to be the right place. So one morning, Reverend Mother asked me to go for a walk. Now, if you're working in a convent and the superior asks you to go for a walk, you're in fear and trembling. Something must be bad. But in fact, she said, are there any other alternatives? I said, Mother, you wanted Anglican alternatives. There are other groups, but these are the largest and best established of them. I can only offer you two others. One is Orthodox. Oh, we don't want to join the Orthodox liturgies. No, Mother. This is a group within Orthodoxy that celebrates very much what we did in the chapel this morning, the Western Rite, so-called. And there's also the pastoral provision in the Roman Catholic Church, which again has a liturgy very much like what we just celebrated, except they use a translation of the Roman canon. And Mother hesitated a little bit, but said, well, do you think you could get some people to come and present? And we had an old friend of the community who had taught me math back when he was in seminary. He was a part-time seminarian and a part-time math teacher, who spoke to us about his experience in the Orthodox Church. And then we had Father Carlton Jones, a Dominican, who had been an Anglican monk and had given a memorable retreat to the community, come. And he brought Father Alan Hawkins from St. Mary the Virgin, one of the first pastoral provision parishes in the United States. And at the end of this presentation, the sisters' hearts sang. They wanted to know more. We had other visitors. Mother Assumpta came. Bishop Vang came. Van, not Vang, sorry. Yes. We had visits from the authorities in the Archdiocese of Baltimore, and the Archdiocese initiated a catechesis for us. It's interesting that the priest catechist was my predecessor in my present congregation, St. Paul's in Ellicott City. And he was complimented by his mom, who is a wonderful and knowledgeable and spiritual laywoman. And the sisters' hearts continued to sing. Mother convened a chapter. I didn't actually know they were meeting. And she put 2 questions. One question was, do you believe that you are called at this time to full communion with the Catholic Church? And all but 2 sisters answered yes. The second question was, do you believe this community is called at this time to full communion with the Catholic Church? And the answer was a unanimous yes.
Oh, even
the sisters who weren't ready to move, one of whom has subsequently moved, the other not, said, this is where our future lies. I had told the sisters that I was unlikely to be able to remain in the Episcopal Church, and that I had my own sense of where God was calling me, and that I would not guarantee that the result of their discernment was going to be the result of my discernment. But it was with great joy that I was able to reveal to the sisters that, yes, God is leading me, whereas God is leading you. And so we were all received together on September 3rd, 2009, by then Archbishop, now Cardinal O'Brien.
I noticed that the Vatican II effects, not necessarily Vatican II, but the effects of people that took Vatican II in directions where it was not intended to go, spirit of Vatican II, had an effect on Presbyterianism and Lutheranism. I remember that when I was a Presbyterian, I didn't realize where these effects were coming from, but all of a sudden my liturgies in the Presbyterian Church were becoming more formal, and I did in the Common Bible. All of a sudden I realized later that, wait a second, these came about in conjunction with the Vatican II. And my guess is that they were affecting the sisters at the same. I was wondering to what extent they were affecting the sisters, the good changes in Vatican II, but also the ramifications in the 70s and the 80s. So was that the time before the sisters were considering the Catholic Church?
Well, the sisters began to consider the Catholic Church in 2007, 2008.
Okay.
They'd been through that, and they did see, how does one put it, some of the influences of the spirit of the council being translated into or being interpreted as support for some of the things that were going on in the Episcopal Church.
Yeah, which had an effect on many religious communities in the Catholic Church in a devastating way, sadly.
But the All Saints sisters preserved a very traditional form, and still do preserve a very traditional form of the religious life, with a full habit, daily recitation of the full office, daily Mass, of course, and indeed they're going deeper into their Catholic identity with more communal Marian devotion and more communal adoration, which are things that joy my heart.
Is there talk about the logistics, if you will, of the reception of a religious or a priest into the Catholic Church? You don't just automatically take off one stole and put on another.
No.
There's some logistics. There's certain logistics for priests, but there's also logistics for canon law, logistics for religious.
Now, for me, once I was received, I was invited to spend a year as a lay assistant in a Catholic parish, what they call a pastoral year, if I were a conventional seminarian. And I spent it in a wonderful parish, St. John's in Severna Park, Maryland, with a priest who has become one of my closest friends in the Baltimore priesthood, Father Jim Prophet. I felt I had a wonderful time there. The people were generous-hearted, generous-spirited. It was a good time for careful renewal in the faith. I loved it. Then I spent a year at St. Mary's Seminary. There were certain areas in which the Archdiocese wanted me to have clearly Catholic instruction. Canon law for practical reasons, but also moral theology. There were some significant differences even between traditional Anglican moral theology and the teaching of the Catholic Church, or the way in which the Catholic Church approached that teaching. Someone, Wag, once said that Anglicans and Catholics shared the same principles of moral theology, but always drew different conclusions.
Yeah.
And that, again, was a good year. It was kind of challenging at age 62 to go back to being on the receiving end of education.
But probably a joy.
It was great. It was a great joy. And I had some outstanding teachers. Really had the privilege of becoming close with people whose class I joined as they were preparing to graduate. And who really welcomed me, and who, the seminarians you're with are a real part of your formation. So I'm grateful for that year. During that year, I was ordained deacon, and then at the end of that year, on June 24th, 2011, I was ordained a Catholic priest.
A couple issues then, Father. When these wonderful sisters and you, who are their chaplain, come into the church, you've been together, practicing Anglicans for a long time, and then you come into the church and there are a number of theological issues that are a little more fine-tuned than they were. And I tried to imagine how the transition was made. One was the issue of confession. Was there confession before?
Oh, there was definitely confession before.
So that was a tradition that, as your aspect of Anglicanism, you'd always preserved.
The Anglican prayer book, 1662 and its predecessors, all make provision for a confession to God in the presence of a priest and priestly absolution. And that was very much part of the Anglo-Catholic revival in the 19th century, thus part of the tradition for the sisters.
Okay, so that was a fairly easy transition. The issue of what it means to be saved, because as you mentioned, that between Anglicans, there's a wide berth, almost as wide as Protestantism itself.
Yes.
Really? Well, now, how would you explain your understanding of what it means to be saved as a Catholic?
Well, in a way, again, I come out of a particular tradition among Anglicans, and that particular tradition says that salvation is God's work and God's gift to us, and also says that it's through the sacrament, the washing of rebirth, as the optional second reading yesterday put it, that God applies this salvation to the human soul. It's not the idea that baptism is a kind of institution which is a public witness to one's personal conversion and one's personal faith. Salvation is God reaching down and grabbing you and claiming you as his own. Through the sacrament of baptism, through the completion of that sacrament in confirmation.
It really is an amazing parallel between how we're changed and connected to eternity through baptism and how we're changed and connected to eternity through marriage.
Yes.
I mean, the parallels of that. You may not feel that marriage ceremony did anything 20 or 30 years ago, but you've become one in a very spiritual, real way, that sacramental union that's there. You can't just break. Same thing true with our new creation as a result of baptism.
You are a child of God. You may decide to be the most rebellious child of God you think God has ever seen. You're probably kidding yourself. But you're still his child. He's claimed you. He's marked you. In baptism, in the Catholic Church, and among high church Anglicans also, you're marked with the sacred chrism, with the sign of the cross. That's the spiritual equivalent of branding a slave to show who owns that slave. St. Paul calls himself the doulos, the slave or servant of Christ, and that's our mark as slaves or servants of Jesus.
Another theological issue is the Eucharist. A good friend of, I think, both of ours, Father Dwight Longnecker, wrote a wonderful article. He was a former Anglican and now Catholic priest, but wrote an article on the real presence, recognizing you got to be careful, because just because the Anglicans say they believe in the real presence doesn't mean they believe in the real presence. Right. So they're from a wide breadth of understanding to you and sisters understanding the Catholic perspective.
And the Anglo-Catholic tradition, actually the founders of the Anglo-Catholic tradition suffered because they taught the reality of the real presence. The Anglicans do not teach transubstantiation, that is, an understanding of the means by which Jesus is truly present under the forms of bread and wine. But they do teach a doctrine of the real presence, which is that he really is present under the forms of bread and wine. It's distinct from, for instance, the Lutheran teaching, which says he is present for a purpose, and then, in a sense, it reverts to bread and wine. No, the bread becomes the body of Christ, and that's what it is. The wine becomes the blood of Christ, and that's what it is. We don't understand the mechanism. He didn't tell us. But he did say, this is my body, this is my blood. So, both in the parish I served in Atlanta and again at the convent, the Blessed Sacrament was reserved, was honored with the genuflection whenever we entered or left the chapel. We had adoration, we had benediction and adoration every Sunday, surrounding following the celebration of Vespers. They now have a longer period of adoration, and the Vespers is said with the Blessed Sacrament exposed. So I get confused between then and now. There was a very rich Eucharistic piety in that community. It tends to be reserved in its expression. That's partly the English heritage. But it was very deep and still is very deep.
You had mentioned that this kind of maybe apocryphal way of looking at the difference between Catholics and Episcopals' way of looking at moral issues. You know, the same principle but different conclusions. But what about then moving into the Catholic perspective? Because most of us realize it was that Lambeth Conference in the 1930s that opened the can of worms for all the stuff that we're seeing today. That was on the plate of the Episcopalians and the Anglicans. Oh, yes. How about that for you and the sisters, recognizing the Catholic views of contraception?
Well, it has become obvious it became obvious to the sisters and myself, and I think has become more widely obvious to persons who hold to the tradition, that basically the acceptance of contraception, while not necessarily having a linear connection, has had an actual or historical connection with the loosening of sexual mores and with the ultimate insult to life, abortion.
Yeah.
Sometimes a thing that in itself does not seem objectionable, and to be fair, if you look at the minutes of the 1930 Weymouth Conference, they were talking about hard cases, not about generic approval of contraception. But sometimes, even when you talk about and make an exception for a hard case, it comes back and bites you in ways you didn't expect.
Yeah, because one person's hard case is not a hard case for another, and you're trying to describe, and pretty soon the door just opens and opens, because the evil one wants a whisper in our ears, and open that can. I know I opened this can of worms earlier, so I've got to bring it back. Good old Henry VIII. How do Anglicans look in the mirror and look at how their whole tradition started?
Okay, if you ask a Lutheran, when did the Lutheran Reformation occur, they'll point to the 1520s and to one figure, Martin Luther, and it ends shortly after his death with basically the Lutheran completion of the Lutheran confessions. If you ask an Anglo-Catholic to describe the Anglican Reformation, they will talk about a process that starts with Henry, but doesn't end until James II, almost 200 years, during which things started in a very Catholic way. I think one of the reasons why most of the English bishops didn't oppose Henry, but stayed with him even after he separated from the Catholic Church, was simply that this kind of thing had happened before in the history of England and of Europe. And, eventually they get over it, things come right, and we're Catholics again. I think that Thomas More and Bishop Fisher saw wisely that things had changed, the nature of the nation state had changed, and that wasn't true anymore. But Henry made no changes in doctrine. The change in liturgy was that you prayed for the king instead of for the pope. Henry faced opposition, and that opposition was particularly visible in some of the religious communities. Anglicans, like myself, would say, Henry really didn't have it in for the religious communities, but when the religious communities seemed to be supporting those who opposed him, he came down hard, and he had the added advantage of having Downton Abbeys to hand out to people who then became his creatures, loyal to him. With Henry's death, there was a very Protestant regency. Archbishop Cranmer got his opportunity to impose a new liturgy, and a liturgy that was, despite fairly traditional language, really an expression of justification by faith alone, according to the liturgist Dom Gregory Dix. Elizabeth brings a little bit more balance between the old ways and the new, but Elizabeth's birth is in question. Thus, the legitimacy of her reign is in question. The Pope excommunicates her. As a consequence, Catholics are traitors because they're a threat to her crown. And you begin the awful persecution of Catholics in general, but also, in particular, of any Catholic priest who came into the country to serve those Catholics. With the Jameses and the Charleses, you have more of a return to the more Catholic side of Anglicanism. And so people like to say that, when the English Reformation was completed under James II, you had a reformed Catholicism. I think that there is substance to the arguments that have been offered. If you go back and read the Oxford divines from the 19th century, the people who led the Oxford movement, including Newman himself, I think that there is substance to their argument. John Keble, who set that movement off, basically said the Anglican Church today has lost its identity and is in grave problems. We need to reclaim that identity. And his identity was the Catholic Church moderately reformed. Today, however, what we find is that more and more the things that he would point to, or did point to, as the Catholic belief of Anglicans are marginalized or really have been done away with. I've sometimes have been asked by the press, from whom I try to stay away, that about the hot button issues, ordination of women, the sexuality stuff. But there has really been as well a kind of demeaning of what Anglicans are wont to call core doctrine. People who say the creed because that's part of our historic identity, but we don't believe these things that the creed says. And that, for me, was the hardest part.
Yeah, and I mean, during the time of, what a fascinating subject. Thank you for summarizing that. I mean, it really is. Because there became that time where you couldn't speak out for danger.
Yep.
And that really was a life that came to this country.
Yes.
And through our English colonies, and really you weren't allowed to be a Catholic priest in America until after the American Revolution.
Well, you could be in Maryland.
That was it. Well, and the interesting thing about that was it began as a Catholic colony, but as soon as the religious freedom of the colony opened the doors to non-Catholics, they took over and imposed the rules.
It was made a crown colony, and the normal rules prevailed. But in practice, there was relative toleration of existent Catholic communities. It was not easy, but the Jesuit gentlemen, as they were called, who ran plantations and churches in southern Maryland, continued to run their plantations and churches.
The Carrolls.
Yes.
You know, that's still, to me, a puzzlement to this day, is how Charles Carroll, who was the only Catholic to sign the Declaration, got into politics at all because of his Catholicism. Mm-hmm. That's another story I'd love to read. Thank you so much. Let's see if we can get one email in from Denise. My husband is an Episcopal priest, and we've been recently discussing how to continue serving in the Episcopal Church, considering the fact that we strongly disagree with many of the decisions that have been made by the Episcopal Church, especially on moral issues. We have become torn as to whether we should stay where we are and continue serving the people we love in hopes we are a witness of orthodoxy, or if we should move towards Catholicism. The Catholic Church, of course, would be a difficult move considering my husband's ministry. We are wondering if you have any advice for us.
Okay. A couple pieces of advice. First, you must pray, pray, pray. Coming into the Catholic Church is a matter of following the grace of God. And that grace has to do with what you do, how you do it, and when you do it. It must be clear that this is what God requires of you. For myself, I reached a point where, though I knew that I was giving a witness, I recognized that that witness had little or no effect. And that was part of the way God helped me discern that I needed to move. It was right for me to move. The part of the discernment that I would think Denise and her husband might want to take up is this simply something that has to do with us? Or is this part of our ministry to the community we're serving? One might presume that that community also is uncomfortable with a lot of the things that are going on. Maybe, as in the case of some of the congregations that I know that have entered the ordinariate, sitting down with the people, talking about those issues with the people, talking about the Catholic Church as a refuge with the people, is part of what needs to be done. Third, there are no guarantees about ordination in the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church has been generous, especially where a priest comes with a congregation or a coetus, a group, is the language that we use. And that if you believe that that's your call, humbly approach the Church and submit yourself to the Church's judgment.
Father Tanghe, thank you very much. Could we quickly have your blessing?
Absolutely. The blessing of Almighty God, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit come down upon you and remain with you always. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for joining us on The Journey Home. Thank you for watching this episode of The Journey Home. I pray that Father Tanghe's witness, courageous witness, is an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you next week.